I was born and raised in Kazakhstan, and I grew up speaking Russian. As a child, I was regularly exposed to the idea that the United States is to blame for the historical and ongoing conflicts in the former Soviet Union. An idea that I accepted without giving it much thought. However, 2 years ago, when I was 14, my family and I moved to the United States, and this has allowed me to learn firsthand about the American people, culture, ideas, and politics. And so, my view of relations between the United States and the former Soviet Union has become much more humane and complex. One of my favorite TED Talks given by the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warns about the dangers of a single story, of harboring a single conception of what a country or a culture is. Since moving to the United States a few years ago, I have learned that the single story I was told when I was growing up about the United States was a gross oversimplification. And I have observed how that misconception contributes to the mutual antagonism between our two parts of the world. For example, when I lived in Kazakhstan, part of the single story I was told about the United States is that the US wants to take over the world. The US occupation of Iraq in the heart of the Middle East and the US occupation of Afghanistan at the nexus of South and Central Asia are two of the data points that were in support of this, or so I was told. Because I have lived in New York for a few years now, I understand that those occupations were driven by anxiety and fear after September 11th, instead of by strategy and ambition. At the same time, I have learned that American society harbors a single story of Russia and Central Asian countries too, and this not only contributes to the mutual antagonism between our two parts of the world, but it also unintentionally and ironically perpetuates the power of oppressive forces in Central Asia. I wish to disabuse the American audience of the single story they have in mind about Russia and Central Asia by providing what the historian Howard Zinn might have called a people's telling of stories and perspectives from the former Soviet Union lands, which I hope will increase understanding and affinity between our two peoples. So, what is the single story that people in the United States have in mind about Russia and Central Asia? I have observed a few elements of the story, which include 1, moral depravity, 2, a cold, robotic, non-human quality often associated with violence, and 3, chaotic societies. I have also observed that the single story that people in the United States have in mind is mostly shaped by TV and movies. Many of my American friends who have this single story in mind had barely ever met someone from that part of the world before they met me, and yet they assumed that the single story they had in mind was accurate without giving it much thought. For example, my American friends assume that Central Asians are morally backward in large part because they have seen Central Asian characters portrayed that way on TV. The most popular example is the movie Borat. The fictional Central Asian character Borat laughs when telling a story about a woman being raped and a handicapped person being put in a cage. He makes racist jokes to the Roma people, who he refers to as gypsies. Because Americans observe these behaviors by a fictional Central Asian character who was actually invented by an English comedian, they assume that those behaviors are true of Central Asians. Of course, other Americans know it's not true, but they don't have any other frames of reference. So, when you think of the morality of Central Asians, I would suggest that you think of another example instead. This is a photo taken by a friend of mine on a Central Asian highway. You can see that a person was driving his car, and he got his tires stuck on the side of the road in a space. All of those people in the photo are strangers to him. They've never met him before. And yet, when they saw the situation the poor driver was in, they stopped their cars one by one in order to help him. I see examples of behavior like this all the time in Central Asia and Russia. In the United States, I see people get their tires stuck on the road often, but I barely see total strangers stopping what they're doing in order to help the poor driver. When was the last time you saw something like that in the United States? I am not saying that people in the United States are less moral than people in Central Asia or Russia. Instead, I'm challenging you to be more careful when you think about how to judge people, whether people are morally backward or not. Similarly, there is a tradition in Kazakhstan of opening your home to travelers you don't know well in the spirit of hospitality. This tradition emerged from the Kazakh experience of being nomads historically and letting other travelers stay in their temporary nomadic homes without asking them anything until they're fed and given all they needed. So now, even though Kazakhstan is no longer a nomadic country, and we have big, modern cities and towns, people continue to welcome essential strangers into their homes. Let's move on to another part of the single story that Americans have in mind about Russians and Central Asian people, associating them with robotic, non-human quality, even violence. When my mother and I ride the subway in New York, most of the time we speak Russian, and I notice how some people react with negative facial expressions, as if we might be saying something bad, something they should be afraid or suspicious of. In fact, you can learn a lot about the stereotypes you have about people if you pay attention to what your reaction is when you hear their language being spoken or their accented English. I have noticed that people find Australian accents funny and friendly, so why do people fear my Russian accented English? Language is actually one of the most humanizing parts of our culture. We cherish literature from the likes of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and we believe that literacy is something akin to a human right. When I came to the United States, I was surprised to learn that 1 out of every 7 people is illiterate. I could not believe that a country would allow any of its citizens, let alone so many of its citizens, to be without the ability to read. Because in Russia and the former Soviet Union countries, the literacy rate is above 99.5%, according to countryeconomy.com. Part of the reason why people react badly to hearing my mom and I speak Russian on the subway is because when they have heard Russian or Russian accent in English before, it is usually by an intimidating character in an action movie, often some kind of a criminal. Like Teddy KGB, played by John Malkovich in the movie Rounders, or the gangster who loans money to Bradley Cooper in the movie Limitless. Similarly, my friends in my American school initially had the impression that Russia and Central Asia is lawless. But the But the single story of Central Asia as lawless is no more appropriate than the single story of the United States as lawless, based on the prevalence of gun violence and the uniquely American phenomenon of repeated mass shootings of children while they're at school. Again, I'm not at all suggesting that American people are more violent than Russian and Central Asian people. Instead, I'm arguing that if you're one of the many Americans who instinctively reacts with anxiety or suspicion when you hear a foreign language being spoken, that reaction is no more sensible than if a Russian or Central Asian person were to think that you're likely to shoot them with a gun because you come from America where gun violence is common. I'm trying to convey the harm that the single story can cause to the labeling of people. In fact, the beautiful cliché that we are more alike than we're unalike is not simply poetic, it is empirical. To take just one example, the percentage of Americans and Russians who donate to charity is roughly the same, at around 50%. So instead of fearing each other, shouldn't we focus on raising that number up to 75%? Now, that statistic does not at all mean that there are no political problems from where I come from. In fact, there are many political problems. But most of the people there are most of the people here. There are good and bad, friendly and unfriendly, funny and serious. In other words, there is no single story of Russia and Central Asia, just like there is no single story of the United States. There are many stories. And when you subscribe to the idea that there is a single story, you have something in common with the demagogues. Just like Chimamanda Ngozi, I'm breaking down the misconceptions in the single story of my homeland. In closing, if you have really understood the main idea of my speech, then the next time your car gets stuck on the side of the road, you should think to yourself, man, I wish I was in Kazakhstan right now. Thank you.